Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC Week 2 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. Really excited to do this video. The LEC is always wild. Of all of the regions that we cover on this channel, this is the one where the results are the least expected. Pretty much consistently. Upsets after upsets after upsets, and this week, there was no exception. This continued to be a very confusing week in terms of trying to figure out where exactly a lot of these teams lie, but it made for some really fun League of Legends and some really fun games to talk about. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Of course, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of Week 2 here in the LEC, of course, with the condensed quote-unquote regular season, the best of one stage. We don't really get to see a ton of these teams as quickly as we might like, but at the very least, we're starting to get an idea of where some of the roster changes have, kind of taken some of these orgs and maybe where some of these teams' ceilings and floors could be. So I want to hear you guys' thoughts as well down in the comment section below. But of course, with that being said, it's time to jump into it. If you are new here, what we do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages of both teams, giving out a player of the game, giving out a dud of the game, and at the end of the week, I will be updating my power rankings from 1 to 10, as well as giving out a player of the week and a dud of the week here for Week 2 in the LEC. So let's go ahead and kick off with day number 1. And we kicked off day number 1 with the battle of 1 and 2 teams, SK Gaming taking on Team BDS. And BDS does pick up the win. Really nice to see. They struggled a little bit more. I think that a lot of people expected to see them struggle in week number 1. Had a lot of people saying that they were the most consistent team in the LEC. Not just in my comment section, but I mean, go look at the analysts of the LEC. They were all preaching that narrative. I believe that they put them as the only team in S tier in their tier list at the beginning of the split. And, that sentiment was definitely echoed on, pregame lobbies and things like that. But I was a little bit more hesitant when it came to BDS because, while I do like their upside, and I do think that this bot lane is very consistent, Adam's probably their most talented player, and he can be rather inconsistent. Sheo's been really good, but has kind of just broken onto the scene, and I've always been a little bit lower on Nuke, I think, than other people, and so I was worried about their floor a little bit more than maybe other analysts were, and that has come to fruition a bit, but it's nice to see them get back on track, going up against a team like SK Gaming that, for all intents and purposes, can be rather shaky, and certainly have fallen off a bit since their fantastic winter split. But player of the game for me in this first game of the week is going to go to Sheo in the jungle. Really good Sejuani play, and I'm just happy to see Sheo continue to be good. You were a little bit worried, or at least I was, that this jungle mid duo was definitely bouncing off of each other because of how good the side lanes were, a little bit better than they might in a worse scenario. But of the two, I trust Sheo a lot. I think he really can be a top 2, top 3 jungler in this region if he continues to grow. I'm not saying he's there yet. I think I had him at number 4 in my pre-split power rankings. I continue to think of him rather in that spot, but this was just a phenomenal Sejuani game, a complete jungle masterclass. Was able to generate that lead early, and on a pick like Sej, that can be very dangerous and very difficult to actually play out of, and then was able to translate that into trying to get the rest of his map ahead. You've got the Zeri, you've got the Lulu to be able to try and get that late game power going. You've got a Syndra, which is actually really easy to make plays with the Sejuani, and of course, the super overpowered Cassante that continues to just be a really good pick for basically everybody here in the LEC on the top side. And so your draft was definitely very good, and especially when you got that facilitator, that creator kind of rolling in the jungle, I think it really made their job a lot easier. But like I said, everybody else was also really good here. Adam in particular was just phenomenal towards the back half of this game. When Adam is clicking, when he's playing at a high level, BDS is basically unbeatable. He is one of those players that will legitimately 1v9 a game in the LEC, and he's not going to be able to do it every single game. We're going to see a lot of games where he can be a little bit more up and down. We saw that in the playoffs, and most specifically in the best of 5s last split, where he was good, just not that guy. Like Crowny and Labrov were definitely those guys for BDS, but Adam was still good. But when he clicks, when he's on, when he's like dominating team fights in the way that he can, this team's very difficult to deal with. Nuke and Crowny, I think, also did their jobs incredibly well, and Labrov's just very, very solid. And so BDS still the scary team that we all kind of thought they would be. That's why I kept them at number 3 in my power rankings, even after a rough week. I expected them to be able to bounce back, and they did here. But as for SK, probably one of the weaker teams in the league at the moment. Definitely a frustrating thing to see considering how well their winter split went, how much of a breakout split players like Exakick had earlier on in the split, even Marcoon. They just really haven't been able to keep that momentum up with the rest of the league kind of leveling up and getting better. It feels like they've stayed relatively stagnant, and that's really put them in a rough spot because talent-wise, they're just kind of there with the rest of the league. Not that they can't be, near the top, and I still really like Exakick, but the rest of these players really just have not been able to keep up with the rest of the league. Most specifically, this jungle mid duo, which has really struggled. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Certus again. Very tough to take static Shiv LeBlanc and be like completely useless, but that's kind of what he was in this game, which is surprising, especially for Certus, because when you cast your mind back to his time in the ERLs, he was known as a LeBlanc one-trick, or not really a one-trick, but certainly an assassin player, and LeBlanc was really the big pick that you kind of knew Certus for in the ERLs, and so to see him, play LeBlanc in a meta where she's really strong with a very specific item and just be completely useless in the game, it's very frustrating, and I think Certus kind of coming back down to earth after a really good winter split is a big reason why SK has struggled a little bit more. You have to have that pressure coming up the middle of the map, and I just don't think SK has had that, and, I think Certus has kind of gone back to what we can expect a little bit more from him, being one of the, I don't want to say weaker mid laners, because that's not really fair. He is, but it's not really his fault. He's not a bad player. It's just mid lane in the LEC is so stacked. There's so much good talent right now that Certus, unfortunately, is just not able to hold up. But Marcoon has also taken some pretty big steps back. I think he's been fine. He's been solid, but this was a pretty bad game from him on the Wukong. You really have to generate that early lead against Sedge, or else you're not going to have any map pressure in the mid game, and unfortunately for Marcoon, that was just the case. Irrelevant wasn't really able to do much. Exakick and DOS were basically not in this game. They weren't really doing anything, and so SK just looks a little bit lost. It feels like their weak links are being exploited, and their best players are just not at the point where they can actually capitalize on that. So hopefully they're going to be able to step it up, but for now, they just look relatively weak. And then for BDS, glad to see them get back to 500. Hopefully they can keep it up the rest of the week, because you don't really want to be moving into the final week, going a little bit cold, but right now, I think at least in this showing, they show that they can still be that team that was an upper quadrant team from last split. And then moving on to our second game here of day number 1, and it's a battle between a winless team and an undefeated team that, of course, didn't go the way we expected. We had Excel taking on Team Heretics, and Excel picks up their first win of the split here over the undefeated Team Heretics. Of course they did. This is how the LEC works. If anybody, again, was surprised at this result, then I don't know what to tell you. This is just what this region does. It's upset city, and so congratulations to Excel for being able to pick up their first win. They actually looked very good in this game, and we'll get to that, but poor Team Heretics, it really felt like they were starting to build something. Hopefully this isn't some sort of mental block that pushes them down, in a negative way, but I still like this team, and we'll go ahead and talk. Obviously, there's been a lot of rumors that Excel are doing super well in scrims, but, we all know how scrims go, and we all know how the reports of scrims are, the fact that, Scrim beasts just don't translate to the stage all that frequently. They really just don't, or at least that it can't be relied upon. Good players are good players, and stage success is definitely more indicative of future stage success than what Scrim success is, but congratulations to Excel for being able to pick up this win. Player of the game for me, pretty obviously going to go to Otoamne on the top, and basically all their wins this season, or this year, really all so far. Otoamne's been the guy for Excel, and it's good to see that he can still kind of take over and carry in late game team fights. He can still be a major positive factor for teams. It's the biggest reason why he's the player that I'm the least likely to give up on in the grand scheme of things of this Excel roster, why I think if you put better talent around him or just got him more synergy or something, he could still be a top laner in the league, but his Kazante was phenomenal. This champion is still actually ridiculous. There was a pretty strong Draven on the other side of this map, and Flacket obviously plays Draven at a very high level. All Odo had to do was ult him, though, because as soon as he gets him away from the rest of his team, Draven can't kite out a Kazante, and so it's just insta-death. And so very, very good stuff from Otoamne to basically be able to win every team fight almost immediately for Excel, and look really good doing it. And then the rest of this team also did their job. Abadage was definitely the better mid laner in this game, and that's really good to see. Of course, VTO kind of getting replaced by Abadage, so very interesting matchup there, and Abadage kind of showing that, maybe week 1 wasn't very good, maybe he was my dud of the week for the entire week, but he still has a lot of potential in him, and that success that he was able to show in previous years on his career, mostly for 100 Thieves, is still there for him as a player, and he can still show up and be a decent mid laner. So good game of Azir for him. Patrick did everything he needed to do. Peach was a great facilitator. Limit was creating. Excel honestly just looked really good. They were doing everything they needed to do in order to beat this Team Heretics team, and that's something they really have not been able to do. They would make major mistakes, or they would not capitalize on certain situations that they needed to in order to generate their leads. It wasn't really the case in this one, though. They just looked really solid. And then for Heretics on the other side, frustrating way to lose your first game of the split here against a winless Excel team that has been bottom of the barrel the entire year up until this point, but still some takeaways that I think are pretty common for this team. Dud of the game is going to go to Evie in the top lane, and I'm not going to completely give up on Evie. I know basically everybody else has, which is funny to say because I think I was lower on him by a considerable margin going into the year. When you go back to my pre-winter, you know, my off-season stuff at the beginning of the year, we're talking January videos on the LEC, I was like, we gotta temper expectations on Evie. He was not very good in 2022, probably the worst player on DFM, and, you know, he's being brought over, and he's kind of in the downturn of his career, or at least in my opinion, that was kind of the perception, and people are like, no, he's actually gonna be really good, and he was pretty good in the winter split because that Cassante was a really big pick for them, and they were getting it basically every game. But then once teams learn to either take it away or ban it away from Heretics, he's really struggled a lot more, and that continues here. He just got outplayed really heavily by Odoamne, completely irrelevant in the laning phase as Renekton. That's not very good. Was certainly outscaled and certainly wasn't team fighting as well as anybody else in the game. Just felt like a complete non-factor, and a lot of times felt like a gold machine for Excel, and that was a little bit of a problem for Heretics. I don't think Evie is an awful player, but I do think that he needs to get more consistent if this team really does want to be a top 4 team, like I think they can be. And then the other player that I think was relatively disappointing in this one was VTO in the mid lane. Just not a great Taliyah game. You need to get out on the map. You need to be a lot more, I guess, expansive, a lot more aggressive, and he just wasn't. It felt like he was playing relatively scared in this game, which, you know, maybe going against the former organization will do that, but it's just not the VTO that we all know. It's not what he was in week number 1. He wasn't afraid to make plays. He wasn't afraid to move around the map. You need to do that more on Taliyah if you're going to be able to make that work. But Yankos and Flakked definitely still teamed up to be relatively good, so there still is a lot of positives to take away from that. Mursa had some good engages as well. Only so much you can do on the Leona from behind, but overall, Heretics is fine. I think right now, I'm not going to overreact and say, oh my god, you lost to Excel. These kinds of losses happen, but they are going to need to turn it around the rest of the week in order for me to feel as good about them as I did at the end of week 1. And then for Excel, great. I'm really glad this team was able to pick up a win, but it won't matter if you lose your next, 7 games in a row. None of that is going to matter if you continue to be a bottom tier team. You need this to be the spark, the fire that ends up igniting you and pushing you forward to more wins. I know your schedule isn't going to get particularly easier, but this team has always had the talent to win games. Hopefully they can put it together for more than one. And then moving on to our third game here of day number 1, and it's another intriguing matchup, this time really proving that a team might be legit. We had Koi taking on Fnatic, and Fnatic is able to pick up the win. They swap supports in the offseason, and Fnatic is definitely the one that is getting the better end of that deal. Not that that was really ever all that up for debate, but I guess it's really good to see, if you are a Fnatic fan, that this team is legit. They are one of the most interesting teams in the LEC right now. They move to 3-1 through their first 4 games, and unlike what has been happening over the course of this entire year up until this point, it really does feel like everything is clicking at the same time right now. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Razork in the jungle, and that is such a good sign to hear if you are a Fnatic fan. We've been talking about Razork, we've been talking about Humanoid all year long as being players that really need to get more consistent. They obviously have very high highs. They know how to play in terms of, being able to carry the game in their own different ways, but they really have not been able to gel as a unit, and certainly over the course of regular seasons in particular, they've really struggled to be able to capitalize what they're both best at, and I think a lot of their weaknesses have kind of been exposed because of that, but it really does feel like with a really strong bot lane now in Noah and Trimby, who not only are going to, kind of step up and be really aggressive in the early game, but are going to be reliable in team fights as well. Trimby's going to be moving around the map, a lot more focus on macro. This team has really accelerated their game plan in terms of how they like to play the game. They used to be a very slow team, especially in comparison to other LEC teams. Now, they're very fast, and they play very, very strong. The mid-game has been very good for them, and that was definitely the case in this one where, really, you can talk about player diff, you can talk about mechanic diff. It was kind of there, but this was a macro diff. They beat Koi down in terms of just being able to out-macro them on the map, being in places that Koi couldn't respond to, being able to get objectives super consistently, and just generating a massive gold lead because of it. And Razork was a big part of that. His engages on the Wukong were great, but he's getting player of the game for this mid-game where it just felt like he was always in the right spot. Now, I'm not really sure if it's Trimby coming in and being a primary shot caller for this team or what it is, or if it's just Razork kind of, feeling more confident in his abilities to make plays, but his entire mental feels like it is completely turned around. He made only good plays in this game. Really, he was exactly what he needed to be, and this was like an expert level jungle performance. If he's going to be able to do this more consistently, Razork is going to be one of the better junglers in the league, period. End of story. This was an elite level jungle performance, and then Humanoid was dealing a ridiculous amount of damage on the Syndra. He's such a good team fighter when he's able to actually get to that stage of the game relatively intact. That's why this team wanted to play so late game a lot of the time. Even last year when they had Upset, or this year when they had Reckless, didn't really matter. They wanted to play more for that late game team fighting, and if they lost super hard early, the games would just kind of be over at that point. But Humanoid, I think, really still gives you that edge in team fights because he's still incredibly good at positioning, and he knows how to maximize damage, especially on champions like Syndra. So Razork and Humanoid stepping up is great, but Trimby has been a massive addition to this team. Noah's got like a 4 billion KDA at this point. He was awesome in week number 1, and he's been just as good in this first game at the very least. We'll talk about, kind of future games as we go along this week, but Noah, what really has impressed me with him is the mechanics. They've been absurd. Oscar has been much more solid on the top side, hasn't necessarily needed to be a superstar for this team. Has kind of been weak side, which is not what we expected Oscar to be when he joined this team, but overall, Fnatic just feels good right now, and especially if jungle mid are clicking, this team's going to be very dangerous to deal with. And then for Koi, a lot of the worries that people had about them in the pre-split, I guess I could say, have definitely come to fruition. This team is not playing nearly as coordinated as they should. They are not playing as a unit nearly as much as they should. This team is just struggling in a lot of different aspects right now. Dead of the game for me is going to go to Malrang in the jungle. He just had no impact on the game overall. Talked about the big macro difference. A lot of that was Razork being in positions to create plays and generate the tempo in the game, and Malrang just not being anywhere near to be able to follow up on it. And we've talked about Malrang a lot like this in the past, where it's like, if he's able to generate a lead, he's able to look really good. He's able to choke out the enemy team and just really make life hard. But when he plays from behind, he's just not very good. And unfortunately, he's been doing that a lot more over the course of this split. I think it's a lot more difficult to consistently generate leads in the jungle, by skipping camps and giving your laners leads than it was in previous splits. And so Malrang, I think, has struggled to adapt, especially towards the back half of this year. I still trust that he's going to be at least reliable enough to be able to play when you get to like best of threes, but he really is struggling right now. And the bot lane's just not good. Comp was really bad in this game, definitely outplayed by Noah. And in general, you just need that Zeri to be a little bit more consistent. This is kind of the Zeri thing that I always talk about, where you do have to be the better AD carry in order for Zeri to actually be good. If Zeri was the broken champion that everybody says she is, she would have taken over this game, absolutely, and it wouldn't have been particularly close. But Comp still had to pilot her, and his positioning was really bad, and so Zeri didn't actually get to do anything this game. And that's kind of the thing with Zeri. You still have to play her, and Comp definitely showed the problems of not having a good game on Zeri, and this was kind of the I guess, talking point, the main point that I wanted to make about the Zeri. And so overall, the bot lane not looking great. Advienne, I think, is a fine player, but he's not Trimby, and I think this team is starting to figure that out. They're really kind of downgrading in terms of talent level and in terms of what they're going to be able to do just to out-mechanic other teams, and so their macro is going to have to step up, and in this game, that was a pretty big problem for them. There are major question marks when it comes to Koi, and I don't think any of them have been answered up until this point, this split. And then for Fnatic, they look great. They look about as good as they have looked at any point this year. I would argue this is easily the best that this team has ever looked in 2023, and if they can keep this up, they're going to be a team that legitimately competes for top 4. And then moving on to our 4th game here of day number 1, and man, I was really looking forward to this one in particular. It's always a fun matchup between these two teams. We had Team Vitality taking on G2 Esports, and G2 does pick up the win to move to 3-1 on the split. Vitality really sputtering at the current moment, although again, like I said in week number 1, I'm not going to overreact too much to them losing to some of the best teams in the entire league like G2 is, because they probably should be losing to G2. Like, this isn't really an upset or anything. This is kind of what we could have expected. Maybe we could have wanted to see them be a little bit more competitive in this game, and obviously there are some warning signs that this team is going to continue to struggle in terms of what we're seeing gameplay-wise, especially mentality-wise from the decisions that some of these players are making, but to say that they should have come in here and beat G2, I think really isn't kind of the expectation that this team should have. G2 walking out of this with the win, I think, was expected for me, but they did look really good, and so I do want to praise them for it. This was definitely a G2 favored game, basically, from moment 1. Yike had a really good game on the Trundle, but for me, player of the game pretty obviously is going to go to Caps in the mid lane. He's been more up and down, obviously, in 2023 than I think he's been in previous years, but he's never been somebody who has been perfect every single regular season. He's had a lot of really good moments, but even when you look at, like, as someone who's covered every single game on this channel for a couple of years now, it's really one of those things where you notice more so when players don't perform up to what kind of their reputation level is in the regular season, and Caps has sometimes been that, not because he's been bad, but mostly because he's taken more of a facilitator role. I think in games that matter less, he wants to try and make sure that the rest of the team feels a little bit more comfortable, but when he is given the onus to carry, when he's given something like an Azir on a comp that really wants to play for late game team fights, he's going to be able to team fight better than almost anybody in the region, and he did that again here. He's just super fun to watch, super consistent on a pick like this, and Caps is still really good. I know we've gotten Krabs a little bit over the course of this year, but Claps is absolutely still in there, and G2 is better off for it. It's why I had so much confidence in this team basically all year long, even after they've struggled in a couple of games here and there, or struggled in a couple of best of fives, losing to Mad Lions last split, whatever, right? I've always retained hope that G2 is going to be able to figure it out, because this is the kind of team with the kind of players that really step it up when it matters the most, and I think Caps is kind of the epitome of that against good opponents. And obviously Caps versus Perks is always a really fun matchup to watch. But like I was saying earlier, Yike was also really good. He's been one of the best junglers in the LEC, right up there with Elyoya. I think Yankos, obviously, a lot of people are going to put in that conversation as well. But Yike and Elyoya have really been on a different level in terms of what they've been able to produce for their teams, in my opinion. And Yike continues to just be a major positive. I know a lot of people are going to claim that it's because the rest of the team is pumping resources into him, but this can be a game that you can show people to say, no, Yike can just win. Like, he can just straight up win in a 1v1 sense without the team really playing for him, because that's what he did here. The Trundle was just out pressuring the Poppy considerably in the early game, and obviously this is a really good matchup for Trundle just in general, and I think that Yike obviously piloted it well, but this jungle mid duo, when they're on, is a very scary duo to have to go into, and they continue to be a big positive. I think the rest of this team was good. Mickey's the best support in the LEC. Hans definitely knows how to step it up, although he also knows how to step up a little bit too far and get caught out a little bit too much sometimes, especially on picks like the Aphelios that are a little bit more passive in the early to mid game. And then Broken Blade was good on the Scion. Tried to play Inting Scion, but unfortunately you can't play Inting Scion if you don't die. It just kind of is what it is. A couple of really good engages coming out from him as well. So G2, just in general, looking really, really solid, and definitely a team that still deserves to be considered one of the best in the LEC. And for Vitality, again, some people are going to hit the complete panic button because of this game. I'm not quite there yet, although I am getting close just because of the way that this team has ended up looking. Again, it's not the result that concerns me for Vitality here. It is kind of the way we got to the result, because the jungle mid duo has just been really bad this split, and there really is nothing else to say. Perks is going to get my dud of the game here. He's had a couple of games where he's been really good this split. Their one win was basically off the back of Perks, which is a really good thing to see, but Perks has always been a player that has looked a lot worse playing from behind, and certainly a player that is going to take a lot of risks when his team is not winning. But if you're going to put him on something like Orianna, like, that's not really going to work. I really hate this composition and this draft from Vitality. I'll kind of talk about why. I just don't think you have really anybody to kind of give you that late game insurance if you were to get to the part of the game where the Azir and the Aphelios get online. You have absolutely no one to outduel that, and the problem with that is that G2 actually outpaced them in the early game as well. If your Xayah is not in a super great position by the mid game, this game is over for you. Like, there is literally nothing else you can do, and Perks getting out jungled, or not Perks, Bo getting out jungled was a big reason for that, and Perks just, you know, trying to force plays so often on a pick like Orianna is just going to cost this team a lot. And so Perks is going to get it, but, you know, I think the draft really set this team up to be in a negative spot basically from the beginning. And then Bo was pretty bad as well. Like I said, Yike just basically out-jungled him 1v1. Yes, it's a counter pick in this matchup, and Bo's not really the kind to, like, pull out the Poppy and look fantastic. You want him on more aggressive picks, but if he's only good on aggressive picks, that's not very good as a jungler. That's something that we say about some of the worst junglers, not only in this league, but, like, look at someone like Kenvi over in the LCS, you know? Great on Kindred and Graves, but you have to put him on a facilitator, and he's not going to look as good. If that's what Bo is, that's a very low upside kind of jungle, and so that's concerning. But again, I don't want to overreact. Photon still looked good. I think Upset can be a very good carry for this team, especially if you actually give him someone that can do damage towards the back half of the game. Not that Xayah can't, but Xayah's reliant on being able to win early into a matchup like Aphelios, and it just wasn't going to happen this game with the amount of pressure that they were putting into the bot lane. And so for Vitality, I really just am frustrated with the way things are going. They still have a lot of time to turn this around, and again, this result is certainly not the end of the world, but they've got to kick it into high gear, and they've got to do it fast. And then for G2, solid game overall, I would say. They look good. 3-1 is nice. I would have liked them to be able to beat Mad Lions last week, but this team still looks like G2, and especially in the big games, I expect them to continue to be able to step up. And then moving on to our fifth and final game here of day number 1, and it is a matchup between Astralis and Mad Lions that Mad Lions is able to take to continue their undefeated split up until this point and move to 4-0, the only team to move to 4-0 after the first 4 games of the split. And at this point, can we say it? Mad's really good. Can we finally all agree that Mad Lions is a good team, that they deserve to be recognized? What do they have to do? Make finals in winter? Okay, they did that. Do they have to win the spring split? Okay, they did that. Do they have to start 4-0, be the only team to do that? Okay, they did that. Beating G2 and Vitality, mind you, 2 teams that are actually really good, and Astralis isn't a pushover either. This team is good. This is a good Mad Lions team, and, you know, even if they are, like, a little bit inconsistent, a couple of these players aren't perfect, like, I think we're at the point where we can say that Mad is one of the best teams in the LEC, if not the single best team in the LEC. It's why I have them at number 1 in my power rankings right now. I truly do believe that they are the team that I trust the most moving forward, and they continue to show why in this game. My player of the game is going to go to Carzzy in the bot lane. Kind of ludicrous that he wasn't a player of the game option on Twitter. That was kind of weird. I think it ended up going to Elyoya. I think the other options were Niski and Hilly, but Carzzy was honestly the guy here. Like, yeah, I think if you put a lot of other AD carries in this spot, if you put, you know, I don't know, Hansama or, you know, Crowny into this spot, players that I think a lot of people are more willing to give a lot of credit to, I think they're easy choice for player of the game. I think people just, you know, are a little bit lower on Carzzy, and I'm kind of guilty of that as well. I am a little bit lower on Carzzy individually, but his highs are still fantastic, and he was great this game. You have to give him his due. He was up a ridiculous amount in this game. I mean, he dominated Kabe in lane, and that's been a huge strength of Astralis over the course of this year, and then Carzzy was able to transition that into a crazy amount of damage over the course of the back half of the game. To me, he was the most impactful member of Mad Lions. I can understand wanting to give it to someone like Elyoya on the Wukong, who did play well, or even Hylissang on the Rakan, but for me, Carzzy was definitely the standout player in this one, and so definitely want to give him his due. He's been a lot better this year than I think I've given him credit for. Certainly hasn't been nearly as much of a problem as I have given him credit for. He's been a little bit rougher in the best of 5s than he has been in the best of 1s, where I actually think he's been relatively solid, but he's still a player that I expect to be fine moving into, you know, playoff contention. You don't win a championship with Carzzy if he's not a good player in a bot lane focused meta, and so that's just kind of the gist of that. But Elyoya did play really well on the Wukong. I don't want to take that away from him. A lot of really good engages, and he really set the team up well in the mid game to be able to kind of outpace Astralis, especially when you look at the comp that Astralis wanted to go to. They really need to dive on top of you as quickly as possible, and so the Wukong is going to be very influential to kind of stop that from happening. Of course, you also have a Poppy and a Gragas basically for free disengage if you need it towards the back half of these team fights, but Elyoya did a good job. Hylissang was kind of the primary engage as for the team here, as the rest of the team was kind of set up to make sure that Carzzy could survive in a team fight, and Hylissang, I think, did a really good job. He's been fantastic, one of the best supports in the entire league. Niski got his Gragas, that's obviously great. Chasey was fantastic on the Poppy. Everything kind of clicking for Mad, and it's just kind of the same story. This team plays really well together, and they're really able to execute on their drafts at an incredibly high level, and they honestly are consistently outdrafting basically everybody else in the league. And then for Astralis on the other side, they're fine. Again, they're exactly who I said they were last week, which is a team that is super reliant on their champions in order to win. Leader wants to go for the Akali, obviously. It's a champion he can play, but look at Mad Lions. They knew exactly what was coming. They knew that Astralis was going to play a dive comp because that's all Astralis plays. It's the only thing that they've been able to win with over the last few months. Obviously, that's not true, but it's the thing that they've been able to win with consistently over the last few months, and so they just said, okay, well, play something else and beat us with something else, and Astralis is like, well, we can't really do that, and so here's Vi, Akali, Kai'Sa, Nautilus, right? Here we go. And Leader was a big problem in that sense. The Akali was incredibly useless this game, doing basically negative damage. Static Shiv Akali diving onto a Xayah and doing like maybe 200 damage is not exactly really what you want to see. You need to see that Akali actually do something with the opportunities that are created, and Leader just felt completely useless this game, and it continues to be a little bit of an issue that Astralis might not be able to play if they don't have a lot of pressure coming out of the mid lane, especially in the mid game, where they really struggled in this one. Kabe and Jonghoon very much got outpaced. Kabe was trying to pull some stuff back towards the back half of the game, but he got super outplayed by Carzzy in my eyes for most of this game, and then Jonghoon was basically nothing on the Nautilus. I know they want him on, you know, a playmaker, something that can go in, but having to ban out Yuumi and Milio on blue side is just really bad. Like, that's not what you want to see. 113 was actually pretty good, not like game-breakingly good, but he was trying to pull some stuff back, and Finn was whatever on the top side. Certainly wasn't a problem on the Scion, but the bot side of this map, probably for the first time for Astralis, was the major issue for this team, and probably the biggest reason why they ended up losing. I'm still concerned that this team is just not going to have enough firepower to be able to keep up with the rest of the teams in the league, and I think this game only propagated that. And then Mad is still really good. Hopefully they can keep up this win streak. I'm not going to be surprised if they start losing a bunch of games, because that's just what happens in the LEC, but either way, I still feel pretty confident that what we've seen so far out of Mad is a good showing. Now we get to move on to our day number 2 games, the middle of the week here in the LEC in week number 2, and we get to kick it off with another really interesting result as we saw Excel taking on Team BDS, and Excel picking up their second win of this split, going from a team that everybody had written off because they had not performed at all in 2023. This roster had never gelled together. No matter the changes that they made, it felt like it was all for naught, to winning 2 games in a row here against 2 actually good teams, Heretics and BDS here, 2 teams that I have in the top 4 of my power rankings. You just got to give a big congratulations to this Excel team. They had a phenomenal early game. They almost fumbled the bag in the mid game, and they are able to out-team fight BDS and come back and win late, and you gotta give them a lot of credit. I'm so excited for this team, and it's unfortunate for BDS, but it looks like their struggles that they showed in week number 1, their inability to close out games, is definitely translating here to the second week, and we'll talk about them a bit as well. But for Excel, player of the game, pretty easy choice for me, going to go to Patrick in the bot lane. This was a little bit more of a team effort than it was one individual player stepping up, but man, Patrick finally got to do his thing. It feels like he's never really been given the opportunity to do his thing on this team, and I know, and I'm gonna say it, Patrick's like my white whale. He's my ex that I can't get over. He's whatever you want to say, right? He is the player that I just simply cannot give up on. It does not matter that he has been stuck here on Excel and he's not been winning for quite a long time in a bot-focused meta. I still think he's really good, and I know that I'm one of the only people, not one of the only, but like, I think you could still put him on a top team, especially if you've got really aggressive players surrounding him. He's so good at team fighting. Like, he is so good at team fighting. He's what Neon kind of was for Misfits last year, but just like a better version of that. Patrick is awesome. He is really, really fun to watch. He might not be the most consistent in the early game, but you get him to that late game, and he's going to win you games from even. And that's what he did here. His team fighting was spectacular. He still is that guy that just spaces perfectly, that knows exactly how much damage he's allowed to put out while keeping himself safe. He's super fun to watch him. He really is a big boon and a big asset to this team overall, and I think this team would be worse without him. Obviously, it's been a rough road to get here, and he's been on this organization for so long, the long-standing member of Excel at this point, but he definitely deserves credit for just being so good at that stage of the game. I don't think that there are a lot of AD carries in the region that are as good at team fighting as he is, but Otawamne continues to be great. Another great game of Sion. He's the best player on Excel. I don't even really think that's up for debate. There were a couple of moments that I do think were a little bit up in the air in terms of the mid-game, in terms of where the team wanted to group and put its resources, but Sion, for the most part, was mostly in a good spot, and Otawamne is still really good. Peach outsmiting Sheo into oblivion towards the back half of this game. You gotta give him a lot of credit for that, but he's starting to mesh a lot better. I still think that this team's mid-game is, a little bit up and down, and I think that's definitely because of the communication issues potentially between jungle and the rest of the team. It feels like their calls just aren't coming in quick enough, and maybe that's, them not being able to win and develop that chemistry and develop that ability to play from ahead a lot over the course of this year so far, but that, again, is something that might only get better with time. Abadage, Limit, they were all good as well. Excel just kind of capitalized on a lot of their strengths in this one, and you've got to be excited for them about that. And then for BDS on the other side, I'm worried. Like, I'm not completely worried because they're just barely below 500 at the current moment, but this team shouldn't really be below 500, especially with the games that they have played up until this point. Their schedule is only going to get harder, and they're sitting at 2-3. Done of the game for me is going to go to Sheo. Man, he just needed to land some smites towards the back half of this game, and BDS probably wins. And that's an unfortunate thing to say. I'm not saying that's the only reason he's getting done of the game here, because I do think there is more to the story than that, but it's unfortunate that the game felt like it was on such a thin edge that those were the margins that ended up changing things for this team. I still think BDS and Sheo in particular are good, but this was a rough game from the Sejuani, especially towards the back half. He just needed to be more aggressive, and this team needed to have better objective control, and they probably could have won, but everybody outside of basically Nuke this game was kind of irrelevant. Adam was really good towards the back half, but he gave up so much pressure at the beginning of the game that I honestly was a little bit concerned, but of course Casante's eventually going to get online and become a problem, and he almost, 8 million years to excel into losing this game on his own, but Nuke was also really good on the Cassio. This is the pick that he's been the most consistent on. Honestly, reminds me a lot of Ruby last split, where it was like he would look really good on the Cassio and horrible on everything else. I'm not saying Nuke looks horrible on everything else. He was really good last split, but good Cassio game, and that champion still continues to be incredibly strong, even though people aren't picking it. But I am getting a little bit concerned for this bot lane. Crowny really has not been that guy so far this split, which is concerning because he was great in both winter and spring, where he was legit an MVP candidate for me, and he's probably been the most consistent AD carry across this entire year up until this point. He's kind of been a non-factor for BDS and in this split so far. It's really been, Sheo and Adam that create a lot of the positives, and then Nuke looked good in this game, but Crowny and LeBron have really not been that takeover bot lane. Now, there's a lot of faith and reason to believe that they're going to be able to get back to that place eventually, and maybe BDS are just trying to see if they can win without pumping a lot of resources into them, but I really would like to see this team go bot lane a little bit more. This is a really, really, really good bot lane, and they're not really putting in the same kind of resources I would want them to. So for BDS, there are definitely some things I'd like to see them clean up, and losing to Excel is certainly not a good look for this team. I'm, again, very similar to Vitality. I'm not hitting the panic button just yet because I still think this team shows some upside, but, if these players continue to play at the level that they're playing at right now, I'm concerned about their future. And then for Excel, 2-3. I mean, they're close to 500. They could close out this week with a 3-0, and that would be massive. But this team just feels a lot more coordinated than they have at any point this year, and they're certainly playing the end game a lot better. Hopefully they can get a little bit cleaner towards the middle of games, and then I think this team's going to actually be a little bit difficult to stop. And then moving on to our second game here of day number 2, and it's another one where if I wasn't hitting the panic one before, I'm hitting the panic button now. We had Astralis taking on Team Vitality, and Astralis is able to pick up the win. Oh, Vitality, I just simply do not know what to do with you. You are collapsing right in front of our very eyes. We're seeing a lot of comparisons to FlyQuest over in the LCS at the current moment, and I hate to say it, but I honestly kind of see it. There really are two teams that just can't seem to figure it out, but congratulations to Astralis. You're not really going to see a lot of people, again, talking about them because most of the conversation of this game is centered around Vitality and the fact that they have not been able to get the job done, but for Astralis, congratulations. You were able to win, but it was, again, on a comp that you were very comfortable on. You didn't really show us anything that we didn't already know about this team. It still is very good to see them be able to pick up the win here, but I would have liked to see them do it in a different manner. This is Yasuo, Xayah, Rakan. This is what they've been doing all year long. I can't believe that Vitality continues to just give over all these things in draft. They wanted to ban out the Sedge, the Vi, and the Maokai in first rotation. I get it. You want to take 1-1-3 off of the, more safe junglers, things that Bo can't exploit as much. And the Nocturne was a little bit of a menace this game, trying to go in and trying to create some havoc, I guess you could say. But, I mean, come on. Like, you've got bigger problems than 1-1-3 on Astralis. I just hate the idea behind so much of what's going on here. Congratulations to Astralis. They looked good playing the comp that they're very good at, and the player that really did impress me the most is my player of the game in Finn in the top lane, where a lot of his engages on the Gragas, his ultimates, his damage just in general was incredibly high, and he just kind of outplayed Vitality in a lot of these fights towards the back half of the game, which I was really not expecting. I mean, Finn is a good player, and he has one or two of these games every single split. I've talked about it a lot on the channel, where I consistently rank him low in terms of my top lane power rankings, because game to game, I think he's closer to that area, but he'll have one or two games every split where he just kind of takes over in the top lane matchup if you get him rolling. He's a really good team fighter, especially on things like the Gragas, or more notably, I would say like the Gangplank or the Kled. Those more, I guess, aggressive team fight-oriented picks. I think he can play at a very high level, but he's going to have a couple of games like this where he just looks great, and this was definitely one of them. Kabe and Jonghoon continue to be a really big positive, and then even with a bunch of bans coming out for him, the Sedge, the Vi, the Maokai, pretty much every safe jungler you can take off the board. 113 says, I'm going to pick the Viego, my most famous pick. Like, I don't understand what the idea for Vitality was with those bans, but 113 gets his signature Viego. He's able to perform well on it. Pairs up really well with the Yasuo. I know the knockup isn't exactly there, but those two can create so much damage so quickly that it actually makes it very difficult for the Nocturne Nico duo to actually be able to dive in and create as much havoc as they would like. We see a lot of people saying it was draft gap online from Vitality. I completely disagree. I understand they got the power picks in the meta, right? They got K'Sante, they got Nico, they got Zeri, right? And that's great. Those are strong picks, but you gave Astralis everything that they want. Literally their perfect composition. That to me is not a draft gap. Congratulations to Astralis, but again, it's them executing on the thing that we already know they're pretty damn good at. And for Vitality, they got a bunch of super OP picks in the meta and couldn't do it because they weren't as good on those picks as Astralis was on their comfort picks. And so, very, very frustrating there. My dud of the game is going to go to Upset in the bot lane. I know some people might be saying, well, why Upset? He really wasn't a massive problem in this game. And I agree. He really wasn't a massive individual problem in this game. He really wasn't making a lot of plays. He really wasn't going out there and making mistakes. But that's really been the problem with Upset. We have him ranked as one of the best AD carries in the LEC, and mechanic and talent-wise, he's probably number one in terms of what he's actually able to output. And here he gets Zeri, a champion that people are whining and complaining about being ridiculously OP, and he's just nowhere. He's nowhere to be found. He's playing so safe. He's not creating plays. He's playing back. I understand a lot of this is that the team does need to create to step up, to try and advance the position for Upset to be able to do things. But at some point, as the AD carry, in a meta where AD carries are strong, you have to be the one to pull the trigger and make the plays, and that's always been Upset's biggest problem, is that he's not really willing to step up and be that really aggressive AD that tries to create for the team. That's what like Elk and Jackie Love and all these other like Ruler, all these other superstar AD carries across the world are willing to do when their teams aren't winning. Upset is just not, seemingly not willing to do that. And it's frustrating to watch. Kaiser's been whatever, especially on Enchanters. We're much more in a meta where you can play Engagers again, and it's really interesting that this team continues to want to play Zeri Lulu instead of something else. And then you've got Bo, who's going super far in on the Nocturne. Sometimes it is worth it. A lot of times he's trading 1-for-1. But outside of that, there's no follow-up. Perk says doing no damage on the Nico, which honestly we're seeing super consistently across not only the LEC, but a lot of regions. The Nico is not nearly as strong as I think people were expecting it to be. It can be very surprising, but the damage is quite low. And then Photon was just kind of a non-factor on Cassante. There were a ton of factors in this game that just kind of led into Vitality not really being relevant, but all of it concluded in the fact that they were the more passive team by a considerable margin with a ton of engaged tools on their team. And so you've just got to be frustrated. This Vitality team has no idea what they want to do. It feels like they are completely mental boomed, and I'm worried about them. Obviously, they're going to need to be able to pick up a win towards the back half of this week if they don't want to be like completely shut down, but they're at 1-4 right now. If they move to 1-5, that's going to be a disaster. And then for Astralis, congratulations on the win, but again, they gave you everything. Like, teams typically aren't going to give you everything that you want in a draft phase. It just kind of ended up that way, and so I'm still not sold that Astralis is going to be exactly what they were in previous splits, but this is kind of what they've done over the course of the year, is find wins here and there, and then kind of sneak into top 8, and then once they're in top 8, all of a sudden now best of 3s are a little bit scary for this team because they're going to be able to test you in terms of mechanics. This could be a very similar narrative for them. I just don't know if I'm as excited for them as I was in spring. And then moving on to our third game here of day number 2, and it's another one that I think some people could definitely consider an upset. We had Team Heretics taking on Koi, and Koi is able to pick up the win here, and I know a lot of people were really not expecting this. I saw a lot of talk on social media, and most of it was concerning Heretics, and that's how you know they were definitely the favorites in this game, because whenever, you know, a team ends up losing when they're not supposed to, and people want to get mad, they never talk about the team that actually wins, they talk about the team that loses, and that's how you get, like, a really good idea of whether or not public perception is in a certain way, and the only comments that you can find on any sort of social media about this game are about Heretics, and so that's how you know that they were definitely the favorites in this game, and about how, you know, public perception is definitely caught up on them being a pretty good team, but we got to give a lot of congratulations to Koi as well. They are still solid. They're certainly not a garbage team in the league. I think that there are a lot of LEC teams that are kind of in this bubble right now. Obviously, we'll talk about it, but like so many teams that are around that 2-3, 1-4, 3-2 kind of range that are just like, I don't know where they stand, and they have a lot of talent, but what do they do? Right? Like, Koi is in that, and I think that they are definitely competitive in that range. It's just this perception that they got worse over last split that has kind of, you know, created this narrative that they're not going to be very good, but even slightly worse than last split would still be pretty good in terms of the LEC, right? They were a competitive team that, you know, kind of got unlucky in terms of their draw in terms of the group stage, but they're a solid team, and they showed it again here. Player of the game for me is going to go to Shigenda in the top lane. He has maybe been the single best player for this team in 2023. I think you could absolutely make the case that Larson has also been the best player for this team, but watching Shigenda, he's just been such a positive for this team on the top side of the map. He's been one of the best laners at that position in the entire league, and man, he really knows how to take a lead that he was able to generate and move it into the rest of the game. That's something that I actually think a lot of players at this level struggle with, and it's really cool to see Shigenda not struggling with it. I know a lot of people are going to talk about the loss of Odoamne and about how that has screwed up Koi irrevocably, but I think that Shigenda has actually been very positive for this team overall, and even if I didn't necessarily see the immediate immediate impact that he was going to have at the beginning of the split. Shigenda was somebody who, if you go back on this channel probably about 2 years, I was really excited about in terms of potential. He exceeded my expectations very quickly here on Koi, and he's very quickly become, in my opinion, a top, I don't know, 3, top 4 top laner in the league. He's been very good. Larsen's also incredibly solid. Those are the 2 players that I think have been the most consistent for this team across the entire year. Larsen's just a rock in the mid lane. He really doesn't have bad games, and I think that's always going to be a positive. His scoreline in this one is a little bit better than maybe the impact that he had on the game as a whole. Had a phenomenal matchup playing the Tristana into the Cassio, but he still executed very well. Malrang had a much better game, was able to get that early lead and then transition that, which is always going to be big for him. And then Comp and AdVM, they didn't lose, and that means that Koi wins. Like, it really is that simple. When Comp is on a carry and he's able to actually generate some sort of lead, they win the game, period. End of story. It is, I hate talking about black and whites in terms of the LEC and in terms of League of Legends, just in general, because this game is very not black and white, and player performance is often not black and white either. But Comp, winning or losing, is very black and white in terms of whether or not Koi can succeed. If he wins, then they probably win the game. If he loses, then they probably lose the game. It really has been that consistent, and he was good in this game. And so for Koi, you're excited with what they've been able to show here. Still, the inconsistency is definitely a concern, and Heretics aren't playing up to their, week 1 level right now. A couple of players in particular really underperforming, and so how highly can you really rank them? I don't know, but they're definitely in that clump of a bunch of teams at that level. And then for Heretics on the other side, really frustrating to see this team start 3-0 and then drop to 3-2. You really wanted to see them kind of build off of a fantastic start that they ended up having, and they really haven't had a very difficult schedule moving up to this. Excel and Koi are 2 teams that they absolutely should be beating here in week number 2, but they weren't able to get the job done in either game. My dud of the game for this one is going to go to Mursa in the support position. Just a pretty bad Nautilus performance, a couple of really bad hooks, just very bad mechanics, really, and not something that you would expect to see out of Mursa, because he's been relatively stable, I would say, over the last year or so. Really good on Misfits, I've talked about that a lot, but hasn't been as explosive on Heretics. Has had a couple of games where he's looked good, but, before Flakked came in, it felt like he was really struggling in lane. Obviously, they had a great week 1, but his team fighting has been very suspect, which is not something that I would have said to you a year ago, but he was making a couple of pretty big errors in this game that cost Heretics. And then VTO was also pretty bad for this team. The Cassio into Tristana matchup is just miserable. There's really not a lot that you can do other than, quote unquote, stop the jump with the grounding, but you're not going to have the damage to actually be able to do anything until the late game. And Larsen really took advantage of that. They were really trying to capitalize. As much as I do like this Cassio pick, and as much as I do think the champion is strong, it very much did not work here. The 2 Misfits members on Heretics here were not able to step up, and really, I do think made this game a lot more difficult. Flakked and Yankos were fine. They were trying to create plays. Flakked had some gold, but he wasn't nearly as aggressive as I think he had been. Maybe that's because the team wasn't necessarily there to back him up as much, but I wanted to see that killer instinct continue for Flakked. I'm certainly not, worried that that's going to go away, but it certainly is something that wasn't there here. And then Evie was whatever on the top side. Shigenda was definitely more impactful, but Evie certainly wasn't a problem on his main pick here in the Cassante. And so for Heretics, I really need to see a win at the end of this week. If you go 3-0 in week 1 and 0-3 in week 2, that's going to be a very, very weird place to end up being, but certainly a less than stellar follow-up to what was a great start to the split for them. But congratulations to Koi on being able to pick up the win. They're now sitting at 2-3. They have a chance to end off this week at 500, which would be very nice for them. They feel like a middle-table team, and that's basically exactly where I think they're going to stand. They're going to be able to beat teams that are underperforming, and they're probably going to lose to the teams that are the best in the league, and that's kind of the role that I think they've settled into. Certainly not like the worst, but probably not a team that's going to exceed a ton of expectations. And then moving on to our 4th game of day number 2 here, and it's a relatively intriguing matchup. I'm trying to hype it up, but it was more fun on the Rift than in terms of what we expected. We had G2 Esports taking on SK Gaming, and G2 does pick up the win, but it is certainly not a clean one, and this is kind of just what you expect from G2 at this point, is they give their opponent basically everything that they need in order to win the game, and then they still somehow walk out of it with a win just because a couple of really nice plays towards the back half of the game that just express how mechanically talented the players on this team are. Although, I will say, not everybody on this team played well. You gotta give credit to G2 for being able to pull it out, but I mean, how does SK lose this? Like, this was an unlosable game for SK that they ended up losing, and so let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Hansama in the bot lane. I really struggled between whether or not to give this to Hansama or Mickey X. Both of them really deserve it for this game. Hans was the guy, the damage, and so I'm going to end up giving it to him on the Kog'Maw. Obviously, you hit that late game, you hit the ability for Kog'Maw to teamfight, and you give him that protection. He's going to be able to take over the game, and Credit to Hans, he absolutely did. He was the one that was stepping up and doing a lot of the damage, but he could not do it without Mickey X. He simply was just never going to be able to do it without how well this Braum played, stepping in front of consistent, damage and CC and tanking it all, and then making sure that he was there for Peel and giving up his life to make sure that Hans Sama was in a great spot. Mickey played the perfect support in this game, and obviously Hans still had to capitalize, but I think you could realistically give player of the game to either of them. They both absolutely deserve it. Hans is a lot of fun to watch, and it's really cool to see Kog'Maw pulled out and actually work. We've seen this champion a couple of times in a couple of different regions. Players have tried and given it a shot. It's pretty much never worked because it requires so much setup. You have to be the better team by like a considerable margin to pull Kog'Maw off. You're never going to see a top team pull this out versus another top team, or at least I wouldn't expect you to see that because it's simply too exploitable in too many phases of the game, but Hans makes it look incredibly strong in this game, and you gotta give, like I said, a lot of credit to Mickey as well. They're probably the most consistent bot lane at the current moment in the LEC. It's really fun to watch. The rest of this team, though, definitely some concerns, especially in the early game. I'm gonna do the rare thing and actually give dud of the game to somebody on the winning team, because I really do think that my dud of the game was Caps in the mid lane, because the early game was so miserable from him. There really is nothing else to say. He had a couple of good scatters towards the back half of the game, but his damage was completely negligible, and he gave so much free gold over to Certus across this game that it actually was astounding, and that's kind of what I talk about when I say that SK really has no business losing this game. This was a 4-0 Azir at 10 minutes. How do you lose that game? How is that even losable at all? A lot of that is Caps not playing particularly well. Some of that is Yike not playing particularly well in the jungle, or at least losing the early game to Marcoon, who I do want to give a lot of credit to. We'll talk about SK in a bit, but that jungle mid duo was a problem for G2 at the start. Now, obviously, they got a lot better as the game went on. You're looking at K'Sante, you're looking at Maokai, even Syndra. All of these are tools to make sure that the Kog'Maw can do his job and win these team fights, and they did execute rather well towards the back half of the game. They wouldn't have won this if it was just two players on their team doing well, but that early game was so bad that, to me, they were the most noticeable negatives in this game. And then we got to talk about SK Gaming. There really is nothing else to say other than, how do you lose this? Certus went 4-0 on Azir at like 10 minutes into the game. He had so much gold. He was being so proactive. And then this team just completely shut down. Him and Marcoon felt like they were everywhere on the map, and they were getting so many advantages early on in this game, and then they just kind of stopped. And I don't know what happened. I don't know how we got there, but it's super frustrating. If Certus had, like, I don't know, team fought at all relatively fine, then this game was over. Like, Azir's actually super good into Kog'Maw. He does a really good job of being able to put out consistent damage to be able to match what Kog'Maw's able to do. And typically speaking, unless Kog'Maw's AP, he's got the range advantage, and he's got the safety advantage with his dash out. He should be able to be significantly more effective in those late game team fights, especially because he was already ahead, except that was certainly not the case in this game. Certus was pretty useless towards the back half. I don't want to give him dud of the game, because again, he did a good job being able to generate that lead in the first place, but man, if he was even remotely relevant towards the back half of this game, SK is walking out with the win. Marcoon was really good in the early game, but the Sejuani really can't do all that much towards the back half if he's getting peeled off immediately from the Cog, and then same thing for Irrelevant. Gwen really has no consistent tools to stick onto a backliner unless you're building Everfrost, which Irrelevant didn't do in this game, and so a lot of the Fed members, quote-unquote, of SK Gaming were just not able to actually do the things that they needed to do towards the back half of the game to actually close it out, and a lot of it has to do with them just getting outplayed and them just, misplaying their lead, and that's got to be relatively unfortunate. XK and DOS were relatively fine, but they were significantly less useful towards the back half of the game. SK just looked a little bit, flustered and flabbergasted to be in that position. They were given basically everything they could have asked for with a late-game comp of Gwen, Sedge, Azir, Aphelios, and a massive lead in the early game, but player diff and mechanic diff just kind of have to come into play at some point, and this is why I always talk about draft meaning less than actual gameplay, because you can be given every single tool in the entire book, and if you're not the better team, you're still not going to come out on top. So rest in peace, SK. They're going to continue to be at the bottom of the standings, I do believe. And then for G2, it's a good win to get, but I need this team to step up its consistency. I'm not surprised that they look bad against SK. It's just kind of what this organization does. They take games off against the teams that they think they can beat, but I would much rather see them sit at 4-1 in a more confident sense. Either way, their record's looking good, and they have been good against the good teams in the league, and so I'm not going to over-panic about G2. I just would have liked to see them be a little bit more clean in this game. And then moving on to our fifth and final game here of day number 2, and this was the one I was really looking forward to on this day. A battle of top teams as we saw Mad Lions taking on Fnatic. And Fnatic is able to pull out the win here, ending Mad Lions' undefeated split up until this point and making sure there is no undefeated team here in the LEC, at least in the regular season. Not that that was ever up for debate. Of course, Mad was going to drop at least one game here and there. No LEC team is perfect outside of course, 2016 Fnatic, but still really, really good stuff coming out from this Fnatic team. You've got to be super excited for them because it really does feel like they have finally found their groove. They finally found exactly what they needed in order to get to the spot that can put them at the top of the standings and unlock the best versions of a lot of the members of this team that we've been waiting to see. Razork and Humanoid in particular, we've been waiting to see them get back onto the same page. They were good towards the back half of last year, but remember, they were pretty miserable for most of 2022 as well, and they haven't been great in 2023 either. And so for Fnatic, it's just really nice to see things work out so far this summer. But let's go ahead and talk about this game in particular. Of all the scorelines, you might be shocked to see the player of the game for me, but if you watch the game, you definitely know player of the game has got to go to Oscar Rinnan in the top lane. A phenomenal Cassante game here. That champion is just so ridiculous in terms of what he's able to do on the Rift. He just creates so many opportunities and options for the rest of the team because he can single out the member that you are most scared of and just kind of delete them from a team fight. And not only that, but he's also really good at frontlining, like very surprisingly good at frontlining if he doesn't ultimate. And so really like the Cassante. Not that that's a shock to anybody. In my opinion, it's the most busted pick in the game. I think that and the Milio kind of share properties. I think Yuumi is really good as well. And then Zeri's somewhere around there. But the real OP pick for me has always been Cassante. And Oscar definitely showing why in this one. Ends up getting that solo kill onto Chasey, who's been one of the most consistent top laners in the entire league. Has started off this split phenomenally for Mad Lions. And so Oscar looking really good in this game is really enlightening. He was really good towards the back half of the regular season in spring, but also had a lot of bad games as well. I think it just was a confidence thing with him. He's always been an aggressive player, especially during his time on Fnatic Queso, where he was like the focal point for what that team wanted to do, but it really has not kind of come to fruition in that same way in the LEC. It's really good to see that with better players and more confidence surrounding him, he can still be that big takeover threat in team fights. But the rest of this team was good as well. People, you gotta start looking at Noah. This guy's got like a 66 KDA. I know it's not a shocker for me to bring him up here, but man, the dude has been nuts. Like his positioning and his mechanics are insane, and he's never in danger. Like, you can talk about the fact that maybe he could be more aggressive, but I actually think he's relatively aggressive considering his playstyle. He's just able to get away with it because he knows exactly the limits of the champions that he has been playing. Trimby playing Milio obviously helps a lot. It keeps you safe, and the Xayah in general is just one of those champions that's going to give you quite a few more options, but Noah and Trimby have merged together and meshed as a bot lane better than I could have ever expected. It's looking like prime Trimby, like legit like 2022 Trimby here for Fnatic, and then Noah is better than I could have ever anticipated. Those two have been phenomenal. And then Razork and Humanoid, they weren't quite as good, I would say, as their score lines would indicate here. They look pretty perfect. They had a rough early game, but they bounced back incredibly well to teamfight towards the back half of the game which is why Fnatic was able to take it relatively easily. They had significantly more impact on the game than either Elyoya or Niski on the other side of the map, and that's really all you need to do. You just need to be better than your counterparts, especially when you've got a Cassante and you've got an AD carry that is simply going to do the job. And so really impressed with Fnatic. This team is legit. There is no more questioning it. They're one of the best in the LEC. And then for Mad, first loss of the split, not going to overreact. You're still one of the better teams in the entire league. You were undefeated up until this point, but it is frustrating to see you go down in this game in the way that you did because really none of your players played all that well, if I'm being honest. Dud of the game for me, pretty obviously going to go to Niski in the mid lane. Just a rough Nico game, and honestly, Nico has not worked in the LEC. This is a pick that has been very dominant over in like the LPL in particular, a region where I think people are a little bit more willing to try to mix up their engage styles and just be a little bit more aggressive with how they want to play Nico in the mid game. That's not really what we're seeing from her in the LEC. We're seeing a lot of combos, a lot of pair-ups, a lot of, try burst engages, and it's just not really what that champion I think is meant to do. Nico can do it at a relatively decent level, but we're seeing teams be prepared for it a little bit more, I would say here, and there's a reason it really hasn't worked, and Niski was definitely not the exception here. Really, really poor in this game, a lot of bad engages, a lot of bad ultimates, and it just wasn't going to end up working out. Elyoya was also poor, but really Chasey was the other one that I really want to point out, just not having a particularly good game on the signature Jhin. Jace. That is the pick that I think most people feared him for most of the year. So to see him kind of get run over by Oscar, getting solo killed in that top lane, it's not a particularly great thing to see. Carzzy and Hilly weren't very good. The Aphelios was completely useless this game because of just the sheer amount of dive that Fnatic had with the Cassante. Not allowing Carzzy to play the game at all. And so for Mad, I mean, they're still good. I'm not going to overreact to one loss. I'm not going to sit here and say that they're, I've given up on this team or whatever, but it is worth noting that, I think the top of the standings are going to be a lot more interesting than maybe once anticipated. Mad, while number one right now, that could very well change. It feels like Fnatic in particular has very much busted their way into that maybe top 3, top 2-ish area, especially after this win, and if they can keep their momentum up, they're going to be one of the most scary teams to even just look at and try and prep for in the entire league. And then moving on to our third and final day here in week 2 of the LEC, and it's a pretty decent day. We kicked it off with an interesting series between Team BDS and Team Heretics. That Heretics is able to win, finally. Congratulations, this team is able to pick up a win in week number 2 after going undefeated in week number 1, so that's pretty damn good. We're excited to see that. It hopefully means good things for the future, but there are definitely some positives to take away from this game. A lot of these players continue to just be very high skill, and this really was a little bit of a mechanics check coming out from Heretics, especially from the jungle mid duo that just played fantastic in this one, but BDS, I'm scared for them. There is a substitution in this one to talk about. Adam couldn't end up playing in this one, so Aggressivu subs in to play into the top lane. He's played at the LEC level before, and he's been fine. He's been okay. I've seen upside in him before, but last time he played in the LEC, he was actually really bad for this BDS team, and so wasn't really expecting too much. We'll get into him in a bit, but Heretics being able to pick up the win, I think, is definitely a positive sign for this team, and the way they did it is definitely encouraging. My player of the game is going to go to Yankos in the jungle. Really good Viego game coming out from him. You're just excited to be able to see him step up. Mechanically speaking, it's crazy to see him still be so good on carry junglers, because that's really not the mentality or idea that I think a lot of people have for him as a player. He's obviously known as somebody who makes a lot of the rest of the players on his team look a lot better than they actually are, but he's been showing the ability to carry all year long for this Heretics team in 2023, and so to see him continue to do that on a pick like Viego that can really be a huge impact on the game, it's really impressive stuff. And when him and his mid laner in particular are working together really well, it's something he really hasn't had at his disposal in 2023, with Ruby not necessarily stepping up and being that guy for most of the year. When they're able to do that, Yankos, I think, goes to a next level in terms of what he's able to accomplish. He was the best Syndra in this game by like a large margin, and we'll talk about that. But Yankos is just really fun to watch, really mechanically skilled, really smart player, and he just gets so much done. Really good stuff from him in this game. And then VTO was also phenomenal. The setup to the engage that we saw from the Nico was, sensational. He was the better mid by a considerable margin in this series. Not only was Yankos the best mid, but VTO was also the best mid in this game. It's really cool to see a more secondary carry kind of setup Nico here coming out of the mid lane to play for a Viego in particular. We've been seeing it a lot with Nocturne as a potential way to set up him, to be able to just kind of tear up the backline and jump on the backline, but Viego can actually do very similar things if you're good on him, and Yankos was really good. Those were the two players that definitely jumped out to you in this game, both Yankos and VTO. I think played at a very high level. Blacken and Mersa were still very good. Aphelios Yuumi is one of those lanes that if you hit the late game, you're probably going to be relevant. There really isn't a lot you can do to shut them off in the early game. And, we'll talk about Crowny and Labrav, but they're not nearly as clinical in the early game as they were last split. And so Blacken and Mersa were fine. They were able to hit that break point, and then they were able to do a ridiculous amount of damage towards the back half. Evie got his Cassante, and so he performed relatively well. Just overall, really like what we saw out of Heretics. But if the jungle mid can step up like they did in this game and be on the same page, that's massive for Heretics. That unlocks a completely new level to their game plan. But for BDS on the other side, I mean, I don't want to worry too much, but the team is 2-4, right? Like, they're not looking all that good, and I think it's a lot of the reasons that we maybe expected some regression from this team moving into the split, and I hate to say it, but I was pretty right about Nuke, and I really hate being right about my negative feelings towards a player, because that's something that never really feels good. I want all players to step up and prove that they belong. If I could, I'd have everybody have a good career, right? Because you never want to see somebody fail at that level, but Nuke is just not the player that I think he showed to be in spring. I think the team kind of really set him up in a really nice way, and there were a lot of opportunities for him to basically do exactly what he wanted, but now that more responsibilities can be put on him with the rest of the team not necessarily performing to that standard, I just don't think he's going to be able to hold up in that same kind of way. So he's going to get my dud of the game here. He wasn't even the best Syndra in this game, let alone the best mid laner, and so really, really frustrating from him. But Sheo was also really bad on the Sejuani. He lost pressure incredibly early in this game, and then Heretics just used their macro to run BDS through the ringer. Jungle mid was a massive gap, and that's kind of anti-BDS. That was a concern that we had for this team going into the split, and unfortunately, as much as I do like Sheo, the inconsistency there, especially in terms of playing off of the mid lane, has been a problem this split so far, and so something to keep in mind. But the positive takeaway was actually Aggressivu in the top lane. This was a really good game, probably his best on BDS, including the entire year that he started last year, and so really like what we saw from him. I'm not going to overreact and say like, oh, he needs to be on an LEC team immediately, because we've seen him play at the LEC level and he's just been bleh, right? He's just been fine over a long period of time, but I always saw upside in him. I was, talking about the upside that I saw a lot in my, pre-split power rankings for many different years, whether it be for Misfits, whether it be for BDS. I've always liked him as a player. From what we've seen from him, he's just never been able to put it together for an entire split, and so it's good to see the Renekton here actually, work and be strong, but again, only so much you can do when the rest of the team is kind of falling apart. But unfortunate for BDS that they're just not as good as they were in spring. They've got a lot of things to figure out. I'm still, again, not going to completely give up on this team, because right now in the LEC, like, try to find me, a solid 4 or 5 teams that you're guaranteeing to be better than BDS, and I can't. No, there are so many question marks in terms of LEC teams right now that BDS just kind of falls in line with the rest of that, but they definitely are going to need to kick it up if they want to make top 4. And then for Heretics, it's a good win. Still not super sold that this team is as good as they presented themselves in week 1, and their schedule is only going to get more difficult, but at least for now, they're sitting in a relatively good spot with only 2 losses on the split. And then moving on to our second game here of day number 3, and man, this is the one I was really excited to talk about because it is probably the biggest upset of the week so far. We had Mad Lions taking on Excel, my number 1 team in the power rankings, going against my number 10 team in the power rankings, and so of course, Excel was able to pick up the win to cap off their 3-0 week number 2. I mean, who had that on their bingo card going into the week? I certainly didn't. I didn't expect this team to be this good this week, but man, they really showed up and they showed out. They did everything that they needed to do here, and they looked fantastic doing it. I'm just so happy and excited for these players in particular. Odoamne, Patrick, they've been on this team the whole year. They know the struggle that has been going on for Excel, and Patrick in particular, he's been on this organization for years, and so he knows the struggle that Excel has been under. And for this team to have a 3-0 week, for them to be able to do it against actually good teams, not just average teams, but like Mad Lions and BDS and teams that I think a lot of people had a lot of expectations for going into the split, Heretics as well. It's just really, really good stuff for Excel, and you've got to be excited for them. Player of the game for me is going to go to Abadage in the mid lane. Really good stuff coming out from him on the Azir. He was just so fantastic in team fights towards the back half of the game. It's almost night and day, his performance in week 1 and his performance in week 2. He was the worst player in the LEC, in my opinion, in week number 1, and he was actually really more than solid in week number 2. A lot of great fighting from him, much more cohesive in lane, but really the late game team fighting is what stepped up, and really what made him a more consistent threat, I would say, in both of these games. And so really excited to see that from Dage, because really if he's going to be able to step up and be that guy, be a solid mid laner, which is a position that they really have not had solid play out of all year long, that's going to be massive for Excel, because the rest of this team is solid. Patrick is a very good player, and he's finally getting the opportunity to show it. Him and Limit, well, I don't think they have the best chemistry, especially in the early 2v2. Patrick is the kind of player that can make things happen. He's not the aggressive kind of ADC that's going to step up and kind of turn games around, but mechanically speaking, you give him a little and he's going to capitalize on it. And so having him on something like the Draven, where if you've got the Leona or the Poppy or the Scion going in and you just need him to sit there and auto attack, like that's going to be a massive pick, because it can get him rolling and it can get him into a position where he can really do a lot of damage in some of these fights. And so Abadage, Patrick definitely stepping up, and then Odoamne continues to be really good for this team. Those 3 like main members I think are really stepping up. I will say it wasn't a perfect game overall for Excel. Peach was pretty bad for most of this game on the Poppy. Couple of moments where he looked disconnected from the rest of the team, and, you know, I like Peach. I actually think he was relatively good this week overall, but this was easily his worst performance of the week, and probably the worst performance for Excel across the week. This very well could have been a loss for Excel just based off of the macro that they were showing towards the back half of the game, and I think a lot of that has to be associated with their jungler in particular on this one, but I still think this team has a lot of positives to take away, even if this game was relatively sloppy. There could have been a couple of easier things done, but, you know, being able to pick up a win against Mad Lions is still something that I think is going to give them a lot of confidence. And then for Mad on the other side, this is just not how you wanted to end the week. You started the week undefeated, and you end the week at 4-2. Really not how I think you were looking. Same story, kind of what we talked about with Heretics just a second ago, a very similar story to them, but unfortunately, Mad's getting their wins early, and so that's not really what you want to see. Dud of the game for me was pretty obviously going to go to Chasey in the top lane, one of the best players in the entire LEC in week number 1, and somebody who I think has really been a rock for this team. Not so good in this one, on a really, really strong pick in the Cassante. Really the first person this week that we've seen really struggle with that pick, and I'm not going to overthink it too much. It's his first real bad game, if I'm being entirely honest, and, you know, we're talking about it. Chasey always was worse in the regular season than he was when we got to best of 3s and best of 5s in both of the previous splits, and so I'm not going to sit here and say, like, oh, I'm super worried about Chasey. He's going to be a massive problem for this team. They're not going to be able to win with him. He's clearly regressed, yada, yada, yada. Obviously, I'm not going to be saying those things. I still have a lot of faith that the top laner is going to be good enough. Elyoya had some really good moments in this game, but the Twisted Fate pick in the mid lane was completely useless. A champion that I think is just really, really bad right now. The map pressure that you gain from TF is not worth what you lose in terms of, like, mid lane prio, because that's essentially what you're throwing out here, and I don't think Niski really had any sort of impact on this game as a whole. There were certainly moments where I think Mad Lions could have fought their way back in, but again, rather sloppy gameplay from both of these teams, and that definitely extends to Mad Lions as well. Certainly not how I think they wanted to end off this week, but certainly not the worst case scenario, I would say. I still think of this team as relatively good, but every team in the LEC certainly has had their hiccups up until this point in Mad. It's just kind of a part of that. And then for Excel on the other side, I mean, holy crap, is this team actually good? Like, I don't know. They just beat 3 actually good teams, like 3 of potentially the top 5-ish teams in the league in 1 week, and so that's pretty damn good. All their players looked good this week over the full stretch of the 3 games, and so we're gonna have to see it for a little bit more time before I'm officially convinced that they're, like, actually good, but this is a team that, at least on the current pace they're on, might not be bottom 2, and that's gonna be a massive improvement over the double 10th place that they've had in both of the first 2 splits. And then moving on to our third game here of day number 3, and it's another decent one, a pretty low-scoring one, low-action one, but still fun nonetheless. We had G2 Esports taking on Astralis, and G2 is able to pick up the win. Not a shocking victory coming in from G2 here, but it is still good to see. They moved to 5-1 on the split so far. A really good start for a team that I think a lot of people were shockingly out on. Maybe not out on, maybe that's not the right way to put it, but you know, we didn't see people putting them as number 1 in a lot of their power rankings. Of course, I had them there, but I don't think a lot of other people had them in that area, and G2 definitely deserves to, at the very least, be considered for being the best team in the LEC. They were the best performing at MSI, and they've arguably got by far the most talented roster in the entire league, and so for G2 to step up and be that number 1 team and really look good across this entire week, a 3-0 week for them, mind you, it's impressive stuff, and it is good to see overall. Player of the game for me is going to go to Mickey X in the support position. Really, really good game from him. This is the second game in a row that they played of that Kog'Maw Braum combo in the bot lane, and you really need that Braum to step up, and I think, you know, if I couldn't give him player of the game for the first one because, you know, Hansama was just playing simply too well, and it would be kind of not fair to give it to anybody else, I have to give it to him for this one. The amount of plays that he set up by himself on that Braum and that he kept alive were just insane. I really wanted to give it to him on day 2, but now I get to give it to him on day 3. So congratulations to Mickey X. He's easily the best support in the LEC right now, and I don't even think it's really all that up for debate. He's super fun to watch. He makes Hansama look incredible on these hyper carries, and he does a really good job. But I also want to give a big shout out to Hans, because truly, you still only are able to win this game if the Kog'Maw ends up popping off. Look at this draft. It's so late game focused, it's actually insane. You could argue they drafted a bunch of losing lanes, except Astralis also didn't draft all that well, in my opinion, which we will get to, and people are going to be shocked to hear me say that, but you know, Gnar, Maokai, Azir, Kog'Maw, like, where's your early game pressure? You have literally none on this squad. And so you're really reliant on that Kog'Maw to actually be able to step up and deal damage in the mid to late game. And lucky for them, Hans is a really good player. He had a really, really good week. Him and Mickey were definitely the bright spots of G2 for me, and I hope that continues into the future. Broken Blade had a good game on the Gnar. Caps was solid on the Azir. Yike was good on the Maokai. I think when you look at G2, though, where you see a lot of the advantages that they were able to generate in this game is actually in the macro. That's really where I think they started to separate themselves, is that they honestly just out-macroed Astralis into oblivion. They were the better team across the map, and I think it really created a massive lead. We're looking at a 6-4 game in terms of kills. How did G2 get a 5k gold lead at 20 minutes? Macro, objectives, wave crashing, etc., etc. All the buzzwords I can give you, jungle pressure, all the buzzwords I can give you, G2 executed on in this game, and it was really fun to watch. This is a good team, and I think they proved it again here. And then for Astralis, some people are going to look and say, Cassante, Nico, Zeri, how did you lose this? How did you lose this? You got every single power pick in the meta right now. Well, what if I told you that Astralis is really bad on anything that isn't their style of game, even if it's power picks? And that continued to be the case here. Astralis, more so than any team in the entire world right now, in my opinion, is one-dimensional in terms of their game plan. They need aggressive picks coming out from leader. They need an early bot lane that can generate leads on their own in the 2v2. And that's it. Those are the key components that you need, and this draft actually offers none of that. Nico isn't the kind of, pick that I think Leader really specializes on. He really struggled on Nico across this entire week, and even in this game, there were just no engages that really caught my eye and said this was really good. It's a pick that needs a little bit too long to be relevant here, and while 113 is on his signature Viego, he's got no follow-up. That was really the big thing for Astralis in the last game, is that Viego could dive the backline, and you could actually have some really nice setup for the rest of the team with the Nico compounding. But the problem here is just the fact that you don't have that, especially if Kabe and Jonghoon aren't going to be nearly as far ahead coming out of laning phase, which Yumi just isn't going to do. So I understand the idea of you're looking at this comp and you're saying Astralis draft gap them into oblivion. I think for other teams this would be a draft gap, but for Astralis this is just not what I'm looking for from this team, and it continues to show that you should always go towards comfort over meta. As good as meta is, your comfort ideally should be meta, right? That's how you should end up being. That's what the best teams in the world are. Their comfort is their meta. But the thing for Astralis is they've clearly defined what they're able to win on. They've won 2 games this split, and both of them are on Yasuo comps. That's just what this team does well. Comps like that. I'm not saying it's, I guess I am kind of saying it's the only thing that they can play at a high level. And unfortunately, I do believe that. 113 is going to get dead of the game because the macro was miserable, and his jungle pressure was completely non-existent, especially in the mid game. Dude took a million years trying to steal that blue buff, and I think a lot of what Astralis really struggles with is trying to find tempo in these games, and I think that was definitely a problem for them here. But really, they're the same team I've been saying they've been all split long. They're going to rely on being able to get the picks that they have been able to win on, and if they don't, they're probably not going to look all that good. Now, it's just G2. Maybe it's just the sign of a bit of a player diff, but player diff matters, and right now, I just don't have a lot of trust in these players to be able to play stuff outside of their comfort zone. And then for G2, they're really, really good. Maybe the best team in the LEC, especially with a lot of the other teams like Mad Lions being relatively inconsistent towards the back half of this week. Certainly, we're going to need to see more, but if there's a team you really can't count out here in the LEC, it's definitely G2. And then moving on to our 4th game here of day number 3, and it's another relatively interesting one. 2 teams that have had a much slower start than expected. Koi taking on SK Gaming. And SK picks up a big win here, one that I really did not expect to see out of this team. I was pretty out on them. I thought that they were going to be moving into the back half of this split as one of, if not the most inexperienced and unproven teams in the league. Obviously, these players had worked together before, but it felt like they were starting to get outpaced, like I said earlier this week. But a really nice win coming out here against a struggling Koi team really makes me rethink the position that they might be in at the current moment. And so let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Irrelevant in the top lane. Really like what he was able to do on the Jax. We criticize LEC teams and LCS teams and Western teams in general for not being as proactive in terms of split pushing and playing the map, right? 1-3-1 has really been something that this, Western generation has struggled with a lot more than I think other regions have. But SK did it at a super high level in this one. That was the reason they won this game, was because of Irrelevant's, split pushing ability, being able to create pressure on multiple different side lanes and actually being able to get a ton out of it, forcing Koi members to either, respect the ability of Jax to kind of take a ton of stuff so they have to send 2+ people to stop them, which then leads to, of course, SK getting objectives, or just allowing Irrelevant to actually take objectives and towers and minion waves and get really strong in order to protect against the group. Both really worked here for SK, and they had much better macro than Koi this game, which is really impressive stuff. You usually don't see top laners play this matchup nearly as good as it was played in this one, and so you got to give a lot of credit to Irrelevant in that matchup in particular. But everybody did well. Like, Marcoon was fantastic in terms of controlling objectives and making sure that the sacrifices that Irrelevant was making were paid off in some way, shape, or form. Like, the split pusher can play really well. The rest of the team still has to do something about it. And I think Marcoon was a big reason for that. I think DOS was a big reason for that on the Milio. Probably the second best player in this game, in my opinion. DOS was a lot of fun to watch. Milio and Jinx can be a really scary duo to play against in the laning phase, especially when you're playing as Aphelios, who really isn't going to be able to contest all that much in that particular matchup. But Milio just causes a lot of problems in the late game anyways. It makes, Tristana, Aphelios, the double marksman comp, significantly less effective because you don't really have a good way to get onto the backline of SK without just, like, perma-diving, right? Without Gragas and Kazante trying to get into the backline. And so overall, I would say SK actually played this game really well. They knew the advantages that they needed to generate, and I think they played around it. But congratulations to SK, and congratulations to Irrelevant, who I think had a really good game. And then for Koi on the other side, again, this team really suffers from the comp factor. Like, I need a catchy name for it on this channel. If you guys have a suggestion for one down in the comment section, let me know, because I need some way to talk about comp, either winning or losing, and that winning or losing Koi's game in some way that isn't just me saying that over and over again. But comp is going to get my dud of the game here. Man, I'm not an Aphelios guy. Like, I watch him a lot in pro, and I know how to play Aphelios, and I know what guns are good, etc., but I don't play Aphelios personally, and so I'm not like the Aphelios expert, but even I know how to do gun rotations, and it's just insane to me that sometimes pro players just mess up gun rotations. It feels so obvious to me how to figure this out if you just practice it, but comp in particular has consistently not been able to handle that at the high level. I'm just not sure if he's ever bothered to learn them, but you're an Aphelios pro player. Like, you simply have to know what you need to do. In SK's final push of the game, he had purple-white, which is like the worst gun combo in the game, and so I don't really know what comp was doing here. Just really weird stuff. His damage was incredibly low. He wasn't really able to contest the Jinx in lane. Comp's ability to win or even just stay alive in a lot of these games is going to determine what Koi is able to do, and unfortunately in this one he wasn't able to do it. Larsen's playing out of his mind right now. He's still playing at a really high level, but he looks tilted into oblivion with this team. His interview certainly seems to say that he's tilted, and so that's concerning. Shigendo was not very good on the Kazante in the top lane. Malrang was losing a ton of pressure on the Gragas. Again, he's having a really miserable summer split, and I'm worried about Koi. This is a team that very realistically, I think, to me, could be a bottom 2, bottom 3 team in the league, and bottom 2 would be disastrous for Koi at the current moment. I'm not saying they're definitely in that, but this is a game that they really should have won, and now they're sitting at 2-4, tied with a bunch of other teams, including SK Gaming, who was able to take this, and so that final week's going to be really crucial, and even if they do end up making group stage, I'm not sure I have a ton of high expectations for this team. And then for SK on the other side, I mean, they're okay. Like, I still don't know if I believe in this team entirely. I think Exakick is really going to have to be the one to push them across the finish line. If him and Marcoon in particular can get back online to their form in winter, I think that can be really good, but I'm still not sure that the talent level on this team stacks up very well against the rest of the league. Obviously, they'll have a chance to prove it, but at least for now, this is a nice win, and it's going to put them in that same hunt as a lot of the rest of the teams looking to make groups. And that's going to bring us to our final game of the week here in week number 2 of the LEC, and it's a good one. It's a matchup between Fnatic and Team Vitality that Fnatic is able to take to move to 3-0 on the week. Vitality is going to lose it to move to 0-3 on the week. And they dropped to 1-5, while Fnatic is now tied for first place with a 5-1 record with G2. Incredibly impressive stuff from Fnatic. I mean, just the difference in watching this team from anything that they have shown in 2023, even when they were at their best last split in spring, when they were looking good, they just barely lost to Mad Lions in the group stage, there was some momentum on this organization. It's not even close how much of a difference this team is at right now to a couple of weeks ago, a month or so ago. It's really, really insane, and I'm really happy for the guys that have continued to play on this team. Razork and Humanoid being kind of the core of Fnatic over the past couple of years, and it's definitely paid off here with some really good games coming out from them. Razork, in particular, who is going to get my player of the game here again in this final game. Pulls out the Amumu. That's something we're really not seeing a lot in the LEC. We've actually seen it relatively consistently in the LCS and in the NACL in North America in general. It seems like North American junglers are a little bit more willing to go to something like the Amumu as the hard engage kind of tool there, but not really a lot else to the rest of the world. And so for Razork to pull it out here and for it to work so well, I think is a really cool thing in general for Fnatic. When Razork is on, that's really good for this team. We talk about Razork and Humanoid not necessarily meshing as well as you maybe would have expected players of their talent level to over the past 2 years, but it is starting to at least get a little bit better in the fact that Razork can move to a lot of different lanes, and Humanoid, you know, for his credit, has gotten significantly more active in the early game. I really think that's been a big difference for this team, is Humanoid really wasn't a very active player for Fnatic over the past year. He's been active in the past, but he was mostly a lane-oriented kind of player, somebody who wanted to pick something to scale and teamfight into the late game. Razork, you know, kind of in that similar vein, really wanted to play aggressive with somebody in the early game. So to see Humanoid be able to pick Ahri, move around the map, and actively just help this Amumu create a lot of plays, this is exactly what we've wanted to see out of this jungle mid duo for a while, and it's finally coming to fruition. So you've got to be excited about that, but Razork is online. He is awesome this week, like legitimately one of the best players. We'll get to that at the end of the week, but really, really fun to watch. Oscar Rinnan and him have great chemistry together in terms of team fighting, which really was not showing up last split at all. Oscar had a couple of really good laning phases, but this was a pretty bad laning phase and a really bad matchup, quite frankly, for the Poppy. And so you really needed to rely on the fact that he was going to be a lot stronger in the mid game, and when we got to the mid game, you pair up a Amumu ult with Poppy, like, that's so difficult to deal with. It is very, very tough to actually get out of a circumstance like that. You can basically pick a target and kill them instantly with the amount of CC that you're going to have available to you in that instance, and it really did work out. Those two kind of pairing up and allowing a player like Noah to deal a ridiculous amount of damage towards the back half of the game, that's really what caused Fnatic to win. I really do think they were the two most important players in this game. Razork and Oscar, both looking really good across this entire week, both of them in contention for player of the week. And then Noah and Trimby continue to be really good. Noah, obviously with the billion KDA or whatever he's at this point, the 7,000 KDA, obviously not. I think it's at like 70, 80. You'll let me know in the comments. I'm sure you know, but you know, he's at a ridiculous score line across pretty much all of his first 6 games, and he's looked really good. Didn't really have to do a whole ton in the early game in this one, but that's Aphelios. As long as you get to the late game and you do your job of dealing damage, then you're going to be fine. He was better than Upset, and that's really all you can say. Trimby's been really good on basically everything they've asked him to do. Apparently, he's a really big vocal leader for this team as well, and their macro has been phenomenal, and, you know, they're right up there with G2, in my opinion, for best macro in the LEC, and so that's really good. And like I said, Humanoid was active as well, and so everybody kind of doing their job here. As for Vitality on the other side, Disaster. I mean, Disaster has officially struck this team. There really is nothing else to say. They are in the worst position that you could have ever imagined them being in, 1-5 after the first 6 games. I guess they could be 0-6 like FlyQuest, but 1-5 is still pretty damn bad, and my dud of the game is going to go to Bo in the jungle. He's been really not good over the course of this split. Some aggressive picks that, yes, while he's been able to get in and deal some damage, he's really not been able to do anything with that damage, and the team certainly hasn't been willing to follow up. And then when he's not on something that can be super aggressive, when he's on Maokai and when he's on Sejuani and these more passive picks, he is miserable. Like, he's super not good on these picks that are super meta right now, which is really not a good thing to say. And so Bo, I think, has really fallen down the priority bracket for a lot of people. And spoiler alert, it seems he's been benched for Vitality. It seems like their 17-year-old LFL jungler is going to be coming in and playing at the very least next week, and you know, if they do end up making top 8, it will be presumably the rest of the split. But Bo not looking all that good, and really this was just kind of an encapsulation of a split up until this point. But it's everybody. Kaiser's been really bad, one of the worst supports in the league. Photon has taken a major step back after being my MVP in the winter split, and Perks playing AP. Varus is just having no pressure in lane. This is a very weird pick. Like, I get it kind of into Ahri, but Humanoid's just going to leave. Like, he's just going to go around the map and make plays, and Varus is stuck in the mid lane. He can't do anything, and so I don't really understand, like, what Vitality was going for here, and clearly whatever they're trying to do is just simply not working right now. They need a complete overhaul, and they've got to do it fast, because they're in big danger of being not making top 8, which would be a disaster for a team that has aspirations of making the World Championship. But for Fnatic, they're one of the best teams in the entire league. There is no more doubting it. They are super good, they're super consistent, and if they can continue on the path that they're currently on, this could be a team that actually, you know, contends for winning the LEC. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Week 2 overview and analysis of all 15 games. Up on the screen right now, you're going to see the updated LEC standings after 2 weeks of action. Of course, only 3 games remain to determine the first 2 teams that are going to get knocked out, and look at the amount of ties that we have in the league right now, especially at 2 and 4. It's going to be a spicy final week, but of course, any ties in the standings right now are just broken alphabetically. No favoritism shown here. In the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. So let's go over the biggest risers and the biggest fallers, starting with G2 jumping back up to number 1. They're the most consistent team in the league, and it's by a lot, and right now, they're just the only team that I'm confident is going to be very good at the end of the year, no matter what. But top 3 is all really good in my opinion. Jumping up to number 2 after some massive wins this week, it is going to be Fnatic. You can't deny them anymore. They're 5-1, and they took down Mad Lions. That, to me, is a recipe for a top 2 team. I really wanted to put them at number 3. Them and Mad, I think you could really swap back and forth. I think they are very interchangeable, but Fnatic won the game, and so for me, they end up getting that number 2 spot. But again, best of 1 is very difficult to judge an entire team off of, so I'm going to be very hesitantly moving them to number 2, but still, a massive jump up from Fnatic. They are very real, and they are part of a big 3 right now. With Mad Lions, who falls to number 3 from number 1, the 2 losses are just very unfortunate, and they really should not have happened, especially the Excel one. That one is pretty non-excusable, if I'm being honest. Like, there really isn't a lot that I can say to make that better. I think they should have been able to win that game, but for now, they fall to number 3. I still think they're a good team, and I still think they're going to figure it out. We've seen them struggle in the regular season before and turn it around. I think it's the 3 best teams in the league at top 3. Heretics somehow goes 1 and 2 and stays at number 4. I just feel more confident about them than I do about other teams around them, which says a whole ton about the rest of the league, but 5 down? Like, come on, man. Like, I don't know. They're all weird. They all have their problems, and so order them basically in any way that you want. Even 4 down, really. Heretics certainly does not feel like a top 4 team right now, but number 5 is going to be BDS again, just because I really trust that when Adam comes back that he's going to make this team a little bit better, but man, that bot lane in particular really needs to step up, and Nuke has very much not been good, so neither is Sheo, if we're being honest. This BDS team is really struggling. Excel is going to jump all the way up to number 6. I didn't even want to put them this high. I really don't believe in them as a top 6 team right now, if I'm being honest. It's just, I don't know who to put them below of the teams that are below them. So they jump all the way up to number 6 after a 3-0 week. They looked phenomenal. Hopefully they can keep it up. 7 is going to stay Koi. 8 is going to stay Astralis. Honestly, Koi, if they didn't just screw up the final game of the week, they would have been number probably 4 or 5 on this list. Like, if you just didn't lose to SK Gaming, who I have a very low opinion of, you would have been pretty good here, but that wasn't the case, so they stay at number 7. Astralis I still don't trust because of the way that they play the game and the reliance on certain picks that they need, so they stay at 8. And then bottom 2 for me, it simply has to be Vitality at this point. They're going to fall to number 9. I still think that maybe they have a chance of being able to go like 3-0 next week and just like figuring it out. But if there's one thing you shouldn't rely on, it's Vitality in the final week of the season. And so for me, I'm going to have them in the bottom 2 alongside SK Gaming, who to me just kind of feel like the worst team in the league. Like maybe they're not, maybe they're better than Vitality. Maybe they're like 8th or 7th, right? I think especially like number 5 down, I have no clue. 2 of those teams are going to miss group stage, and I have no freaking clue which 2 it's going to be. If I had to bet right now, I would bet on it being SK and Vitality, but that is not even taking into account strength of schedule, which is very difficult for some of these other teams, especially BDS. And so it's very up in the air. I have no idea where a lot of these teams are going to go, but these are my power rankings for now. Let me know in the comment section who I'm overrating and who I'm underrating. Love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback, as long as it is, of course, in a conversational manner and not just screaming at me. Of course, it's time to move on to Player of the Week and Dud of the Week. My Player of the Week in week number 2 was a pretty fun call and a pretty easy call for me. It is going to go to Razork, the jungler for Fnatic. He was phenomenal in this second week of the season. They were playing through jungle, they were playing fast in the early game, and he was able to generate a ton of leads, really playing off top lane in particular well, but using Humanoid as a like secondary carry to be able to move around the map and just create a lot of pressure. Razork was a lot of fun. Oscar was definitely also in the running for Player of the Week, but the other player was going to be Patrick, who I think was also really good, or even Otoamne, basically anybody on Excel, because they all played super well in week number 2. But for me, Player of the Week is going to go to Razork. And then Dud of the Week in week number 2, again, another relatively tough choice, but I'm going to go ahead and give it to Bo, the jungler for Vitality, who just it didn't have a good week. He's not very good on non-aggressive champions, and we saw that with the Maokai in particular. And it looks like it's going to be the end of his LEC career. And so, very unfortunate turn of events there for Bo, but he's going to get my Dud of the Week. There were so many candidates, it would be insane to even try and list them all here. But, you know, just go and look at all the teams who went 1 and 2 and find a player on the team. They probably were a candidate for Dud of the Week for me. But I'm going to land on Bo as my Dud of the Week. and Razork as my player of the week. But that is going to do it. If you guys enjoyed, let me know down in the comment section below. And of course, leave a like on the video. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We post about the LEC every single week on this channel. And not only the LEC, we talk about all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL every single week on this channel. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything happening in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.